President. Madam President, I have been warning for months about the need to meet this moment of global uncertainty and chaos with a robust national security supplemental. Not delay, not half steps, but investments that show the world we are serious about standing by all of our allies, providing humanitarian aid, and maintaining America's leadership on the world stage, which is why I'm glad the House sent us legislation that includes every pillar of the package we passed overwhelmingly here in the Senate. And I hope now we can all come together to pass these policies once again. We cannot send the message that division has won out against action, that isolationism has won out against leadership, because the challenges that we face and that our allies face are immense, urgent, and interconnected. Putin is waging a brutal invasion of Ukraine, which is running low on supplies. The war between Israel and Hamas threatens to escalate into a far more dangerous regional conflict. Civilians caught in conflict desperately need food, water, medical care, and other humanitarian aid. And the Chinese government is making aggressive moves to grow its influence in the Indo-Pacific. Those are the stakes of this moment, as I have reminded my colleagues time and time and time again. Inaction cannot be an option. We need to meet this moment, address all the challenges before us, and show the world American leadership is still strong. I believe that strongly, and I know when push comes to shove, a clear majority of members on both sides of the aisle, both chambers of Congress, feel the same way. That's why I've come to the floor so many times over the past several months to lay out in painstaking detail how much is at stake, how crucial it is we meet this moment with a robust package that addresses the many interconnected challenges before us. It's why here in the Senate, we took action over 2 months ago now and overwhelmingly passed a bipartisan national security supplemental. I and many others, Vice Chair Collins, Leader Schumer, Leader McConnell, all worked very hard over months to craft legislation that could pass both the Senate and the House, that both Democrats and Republicans could get behind. So I am glad we are now working to pass the National Security Supplemental the House sent over, particularly since it is materially identical to the Senate package that we cleared with such great support. Now, I have to say I'm relieved to see Speaker Johnson finally do the right thing, ignore the far right, and send us what is essentially the bill we wrote and passed months ago. But let's be clear about a few things. This delay has not been harmless. Putin's forces have been on the march. His missiles and Iranian-made drones have been striking critical Ukrainian infrastructure. We measure time in hours. Ukrainians are measuring it in how many bullets they have left, how many more missiles fall on their cities, and how much closer Putin's tanks are getting. That was clear even before I said that 2 months ago. And the path forward, the path we are finally now on, was painfully clear because unfortunately, we've seen this movie before in debt limit negotiations and in funding the government. I believe Congress can actually work together. We can actually hammer out a compromise. Not the bill either party would have written on their own, but one that gets the job done. And let's be clear, the package before us gets the job done. It gets aid to soldiers in Ukraine who are counting their bullets and wondering how long they can hold out. It gets support to Israel, which faces serious threats on all fronts. It gets support to our allies in the Indo-Pacific, where the Chinese government has been posturing aggressively. And it gets critical humanitarian aid to civilians in Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza, including kids who are caught in the crossfire, who are in desperate need of food and water and medical care. That was a red line for me. I pushed hard at every stage of this to make sure we provide humanitarian aid. At every stage of these negotiations, I made clear Congress will not advance a supplemental that fails civilians. I will not let us turn our back on women and children who are suffering and who are often hit hardest by the fallout of chaos and conflict. Madam President, at a time when the world is watching and wondering If the U.S. is still capable of meeting the challenges before us, if we are still united enough to meet them, this package won't just send aid, it will send a message. It will show our allies our word is still good, and we will stand by them in times of need. It will show dictators that our warnings are serious, and we will not let their flagrant attacks go unchecked. And it will show the world that American leadership is still alive and well, and we are still a strong protector of democracy and provider of humanitarian aid. That's a message that's well worth sending, now more than ever. So I wish we were able to wrap this up much sooner. I'm glad we're at this final threshold now. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the final package. And before I wrap up, Madam President, I absolutely have to recognize some of the people who have worked incredibly hard to get us here today. It starts with my Vice Chair on the Appropriations Committee, Senator Collins, and our House colleagues, former Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member DeLauro, and Chairman Cole, and their staffs for help getting this package through the House. It includes Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell as well, and in the House, Leader Jeffries and Speaker Johnson. We also would not have gotten here without members from both sides of the aisle coming together, understanding this is a moment we cannot leave our allies behind, and then all pulling in the same direction so we can deliver support to our allies in Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific, humanitarian aid to civilians, and that message to the world. And most importantly, we wouldn't have gotten here without the tireless work of our dedicated staff. The stakes have been high, the nights have been very long, and the men and women working to get this package together and get it across the finish line have absolutely risen to the challenge. So, Madam President, from Vice Chair Collins' team, I want to recognize Betsy McDonnell, Matt Giroux, Ryan Caldwell, Paul Grove, Viraj Marhani, Lindsay Garcia, Patrick Magnuson, and Lindsay Seidman for their hard work. And I owe a huge thanks to many members of my excellent team. So excuse me for one moment, I know it's a list, but every one of them deserves recognition and for us to all hear who they are. So from my team, I want to thank Evan Schatz, John Ryder, Carly Rush, Kate Kaufer, Mike Clementi, Robert Leonard, Ryan Pettick, Abigail Grace, Bridget Kolish, Gabriela Armanda, Katie Hagan, Kimberly Segura, Laura Forrest, Alex Carnes, Drew Platt, Callie Faramund, Sarita Ivanka, Doug Clapp, Jennifer Baker-Polay, Aaron Goldner, Cammie White, Elizabeth Latham, Jim Dowmett, Michael Dominguez, Jason McMahon, Mike Gentili, Ben Hammond, Valerie Hutton, and Dylan Stafford. I know there are many others as well, including House staffers, who have worked tirelessly on this. I want to personally thank each and every one of them. Madam President, we hammer out a lot of meaningful bills here. Just about every bill we passes touches the lives of the American people directly, every one. But if I have said before, in this moment of global uncertainty, the balance of world power and the strength of American leadership are at stake. So I am deeply grateful to every member, every staffer, and every person who came together to make sure we pass that test by passing the resources that are so clearly needed. Thank you, Madam President. I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll speak just a moment. And I know that we're going to, as the day goes on, I'm sure we'll have a mutual admiration society of the Wilsonian view that permanent Washington has about foreign policy of this country. So I do not wish to speak about that at this time. And I do believe that view is on a collision course with history and the will of the American people. But I rise to speak about sort of the process of the Senate, where we're at, how we got here, and to quote a famous St. Louis and Yogi Berra, it's like deja vu all over again. Here we are debating, Senator Lee, my friend from Utah, has a motion to table, essentially Senator Schumer's effort to fill the tree. And so to the American people who are watching or listening or being reported upon, that means that the majority leader of this chamber is boxing out everyone. That's right. The 99 other people who were elected by an entire state to advocate for their interests don't get a say. They don't get to offer an amendment. They don't get to say, I would like to build a unique coalition with either somebody from my own party or somebody on the other side of the aisle on something we might agree upon. I think the world's most deliberative body has been reduced to Kabuki theater. There's no uncertainty ever. The only time, and this is the cold hard truth to my friends in the gallery, the only time you get to offer an amendment in this place is if it's sure to fail. Think about that. Senator Schumer won't allow United States senators to offer ideas unless he knows they will fail. And so to my Republican and Democrat colleagues who may be watching on TV or their staff, it doesn't need to be that way. This is perhaps one of the most obstructive measures that the majority leader employs, and I don't pretend it's just him. I think one of the things that all of us have to look in the mirror about is whether or not that's what we want this place to be. If we think that, Mr. President, you and I, we've come together on an issue that affects both of our states, we should be allowed to offer those things up. We don't get a chance to do that. Appropriation bills. I know that the Senate appropriators have worked hard on individual bills. Chuck Schumer didn't allow those bills to be debated on the floor. Never happened. We ended up with a few minibuses. That would be a great reform. And how about, instead of every hour, maybe you show up, or what if we sat in our seats and actually voted on this stuff for 4 or 5 hours? We could get through a lot, but the senator from New York is allergic to work unless he can control the outcome. Or say, if you object now, everyone has to, they change their plans last minute. Or if you don't support this without an opportunity to affect it, you're against, pick the poison. You want to shut down the government. Or you're for Putin. All these ridiculous things that get thrown out here. Open it up. And I'll tell you why it won't happen, because it's a real threat. It's a threat to him. Because the idea that other senators who aren't part of, the two that get to make all the calls, that we would find a different way. That's a threat to his power. Because right now he gets to say, come to me with everything, I'll put it in some omnibus, there won't be any time to debate it, they probably won't be able to read it, but if they don't vote for it, you want to shut down the government. So, to all the senators, I would like to work with you to dislodge this concentration of power that no doubt our founders would be rolling in their graves over. This diffusion of power that's defined by our separation of powers and federalism was meant to spread it out, to protect individual liberty. It certainly was never intended for one person in the Senate who can always be recognized, and like last week, did something that had never happened in the history of our republic, which was to dismiss articles of impeachment, even though we're supposed to have a trial. Now, granted, he had accomplices in that. Every single Democrat voted with him. But he's recognized first. He can fill the tree. There are no amendments. We have to beg to be heard, which is why I objected to that farce last week. I don't think it's becoming of a United States senator to say, oh, thank you, Senator Schumer, for giving me 2 minutes to speak. Anyway, there's a better way. It's playing out again here today because we are essentially taking what the House gives us. The upper chamber is capitulating to the House to say, we can't actually affect this thing. We can't change anything. And if you do it, pick the poison. You're threatening the security of another country or something ridiculous. So with that, Mr. President, I would just hope that this is a clarion call for reform. The Senate is broken. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I echo and endorse the wise comments just uttered by my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Missouri. What we're witnessing here is the destruction of the legislative process in the Senate. The Senate's here today preparing to vote on one of the most significant pieces of legislation this entire Congress, that is on a bill to send nearly $100 billion overseas, and senators are unable even to offer an amendment to that bill. By filling the amendment tree this afternoon, the majority leader has prevented every single member of this body from offering amendments to the legislation, any efforts to improve it. If we want to have any amendment considered, we have to beg the majority leader to let it come before the full Senate for a vote. Now, you may remember that just a couple of months ago, we were in a very similar position on a very, very similar bill. Senator Schumer promised a fair and open amendment process on the National Security Supplemental in February of this year. But not one amendment, not a single amendment, was considered on the Senate floor. Republicans filed over 150 proposed amendments to improve the bill, but not one vote on a single one of those amendments or any other was allowed. Why? Why? Well, Senator Schumer blocked every amendment from even being considered by filling the amendment tree. That blocked all of the other 99 senators from participating meaningfully in that process. Now, why wouldn't he want amendments? That is, after all, the hallmark characteristic of what defines us as a body. It's why we call ourselves the world's greatest deliberative legislative body. So why wouldn't he want those? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that an amendment might point to some of the weaknesses in the bill, some of the defects of the bill. It might prompt members to, I don't know, slow down and ask whether this is a prudent idea to send a lot of humanitarian aid to Gaza, up to $9.5 billion of it that could go there, with minimal guardrails, where Hamas will with certainty seize it to wage war against Israel. Or if the U.S. taxpayers should be footing the bill for quote-unquote gender advisors in Ukraine's military. Should they really vote for a bill that does this? That's what an amendment forces all of us to ask ourselves and decide on one particular question or another. But leadership in the Senate wants to avoid these thorny questions that might rock the boat. Leadership wants to ram this bill through the Senate with minimal debate and perhaps no amendments, because they know that aspects of it, especially the $60 billion for Ukraine, are massively controversial with the American people, those who elected us, those who pay taxes to fund these efforts. Now, my colleagues and I are working in good faith to reach a unanimous consent agreement to bring forward a handful of amendments and set up a standalone vote in exchange for expediting the passage of the bill. We nearly had that agreement locked in late Friday night. An agreement to vote on just 2 amendments and 1 standalone bill. But a couple of senators on the other side of the aisle panicked and started objecting to any and all agreements. They panicked because they knew that one of those items set up as part of the UC, the standalone legislation to redesignate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, this amendment offered up by my friend and colleague, the senator from Texas, might actually pass. Remember, this is the same entity that's been firing on U.S. forces in the region and those of our allies, and yet they couldn't let that happen. Democrats will agree only to amendments that they find politically palatable or no, will not pass. Now, it's not always been this way in the Senate. When I first joined this body in 2011 as a new member, individual members could call up our amendments freely and then make them pending. And the Senate would then have to dispose of them, as it does with pending amendments, either by voting them in, voting them out, up or down, or by a motion to table or reject them. But members had to vote. They had to take ownership for their opinions in public. They had to let their constituents know where they stood. Today, the majority leader hides the ball from the public by filling the amendment tree, ensuring that the amendments that he and his party dislike will never see the light of day. This is a circus. It's a madhouse. Filling the amendment tree isn't about creating an orderly process. It's about limiting real debate. When we had an open process, when members could call up their amendments and make them pending on most bills, it actually sped up consideration of a bill. Members knew that they'd have a fair shot in the debate eventually, so they'd be more cooperative. They'd be more willing to collapse time, wait until the next bill to offer their amendment, or take a motion to table as a proxy for their amendment vote. But in today's Senate, we do nothing on the floor for hours while members and staff hide in the cloakroom and argue about what we can and cannot vote for. They twist arms, pressure members in private, and make assurances they can't and don't intend to keep, saying that, oh, you'll get the amendment in the base text of the next bill, or you'll get it as a freestanding measure another time, and then they shrug their shoulders when it just doesn't work out. Why not have these debates in public? Why not allow our senators and their constituents to know what's going on? Well, it's because the majority leader doesn't want to give up control. Sadly, while the Democrats pioneered this change in the amendment process, Republican leadership chose to tolerate the practice and even continue it while we were in the majority by filling the amendment tree so that no one could offer an amendment without the leadership's blessing. For both sides, it is about control. It's about protecting members from voting, the very thing we all came to this body to do. On the Republican side of the aisle, our aspiring leaders need to ask if they want to perpetuate this awful trend. Will they tolerate blocking out members, including members of their own party, from offering amendments? Will they continue to lock down the floor? Will they continue to disenfranchise members and, more importantly, those they represent by preemptively blocking them from exercising their procedural rights? Or will they finally stop this barbaric practice of filling the amendment tree? Will they let members make their amendments pending so that senators must actually debate and vote? Republicans need to ask these questions of anyone desiring to lead our conference. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I rise in the unusual position of supporting Senator Lee's effort to open this bill up to amendment votes. I don't often agree with Senator Lee. I know that it is a radical idea, but maybe in the greatest deliberative body in the world, we might, on rare occasion, actually have debate and votes on major issues. To that end, I plan on offering two very important amendments to this legislation. Members can agree with me on these issues or disagree, but they should be voted upon. My first amendment would ensure that we are not providing any more offensive military aid to Netanyahu's war machine while he continues to violate U.S. and international law. This amendment would not touch funding for the Iron Dome or other purely defensive systems, but it would end aid to a war machine which has already killed 34,000 Palestinians and wounded 77,000, 70% of whom are women and children. And right now, as we speak, hundreds of thousands of children face starvation as a result of that war machine. Poll after poll shows that the American people are sick and tired of seeing their taxpayer dollars support the slaughter of innocent civilians and the starvation of children. And while there is strong Republican support for ending aid to Netanyahu's war machine, the support, I should tell my Democratic colleagues, is overwhelming. The second amendment that I'm offering would remove the prohibition on funding for UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian relief operation in Gaza, and the only organization that experts say has the capability to provide the humanitarian aid that is desperately needed. Israel has alleged that 12 UNRWA employees out of 30,000 were involved in the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th. That is being investigated. I ask for 30 seconds. U.S. unanimous consent for 30 seconds?
Without objection.
That is being investigated, and it should be. But you don't allow thousands of children to starve because of the alleged violations and actions of 12 people. Bottom line, we are debating one of the most serious issues we have faced in a long time. The American people want us to vote and debate these issues, and we should be able to do so. With that, I yield. Thank you.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
a bipartisan majority has been working for months to get this aid across the finish line, and after so long, we finally are at the threshold. Any further delays will waste time we do not have, that our allies do not have. That's exactly what this motion is. We need to get this bill passed ASAP. Let's remember, this bill is essentially the same bill we already passed overwhelmingly 2 months ago. There is no reason, no excuse for delay, not when bombs are falling on our allies, not when civilians, including kids, are suffering and starving, not when the world is watching to see if America is still united enough to lead. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the tabling motion.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, we just heard the astounding claim that it would be, quote, a waste of time to allow individual senators to come here and do what they were elected to do, which is to offer improvements to pending legislation. We're not a rubber stamp for the House. We're not a rubber stamp for either party's leadership in either chamber. We're United States senators, and we should be able to vote as such. And so I'm asking for the support of my colleagues in tabling the amendment tree so that we can have the fair and open process that Senator Schumer promised the last time we addressed the National Security Supplemental. If we table the tree, members could actually finally be able to call up their amendments on the floor instead of begging Senator Schumer to give his blessing for their consideration. If you support a fair and open amendment process, if you want to improve the bill, you should support my motion to table. This will not create the post-apocalyptic hellscape that those in leadership would have us believe will ensue. There will not be dogs and cats living together in the streets, nothing out of the book of Revelations. We will just find ourselves in a position of being able to do our job. To that end, Mr. President, I move to table the motion, to refer, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.